It's so magnificently beautiful. I felt like I was meeting Earth for the first time. No matter where you go in the deep ocean, you're pretty much the first person to have ever seen it. And every time they look, they find new species, they find new geological features that are dramatic. Giant squid, nobody had ever seen a live one. They got to see it for several minutes and watched how it hunted. There's so many things that we could find if we went down there and looked.
Now, you actually dedicated an entire chapter to the squid. Why? I mean, the squid is a mythical character in so many books and stories, but I was just curious why you did that.
Yeah, the kraken, right?
Yeah.
The giant squid.
Mm-hmm.
Fishermen had seen it. There was all kinds of legends and myths about it. There were, stories of it seizing ships and fighting with sperm whales. And surely this was the biggest, baddest, craziest monster in the ocean, right? We like to sort of monsterify a lot of these animals. And but nobody had ever seen a live one. They had found pieces of them washed up on shore. They had found bits of dead ones, but it wasn't until 2015 that scientists actually figured out a way to draw it close to a sub, and they had a sub with a plexiglass hull, so they filmed it. Scientists love these plexiglass hulled subs because they can see everything. It's like floating in a bubble. So they created a lure. It was a marine scientist named Edie Witter, really studies bioluminescence and is really creative, and she figured out that they were probably eating a particular type of jellyfish, and she made a lure that flashed like this jellyfish. And sure enough, here comes a giant squid off Japan. And the video footage has been viewed by millions. But what was really amazing about it was they had no idea how beautiful it was and how fluid it was. And it looked like it was metallic. Like their skin is just amazing. But when you see a dead one, the skin is, all the life has gone out of it. But when they're in their environment, they're flashing colors. They really do look metallic. And they got to see it for several minutes and watch how it hunted. And, we had always assumed that this was the most aggressive killer. But what they think now is that it's actually a really shy predator. And it's just very opportunistic and very good at hiding. It has eyes as big as volleyballs, the biggest eyes of any animal on Earth. And it can pick up very, very faint bits of light. And they think that's because when its arch predator, which is a sperm whale, zooms through the ocean hunting, it jostles all the microorganisms around it and they emit bioluminescence. So if the giant squid can see trails of bioluminescence, it would know that a sperm whale is maybe coming and be able to flee. So it's not actually the aggressor, they don't think. And they have found they have a beak in the middle, like it's like a parrot's beak, and it doesn't biodegrade or anything. So when a sperm whale carcass is examined, they often find like dozens of these giant squid beaks. So it's clear that they're being hunted. They're not just the hunters.
Right.
Yeah. So every time we see these animals that we've never seen before, we learn something about strategies for staying alive and strategies for living in such a different environment than ours.
Yeah, I found it so interesting too, and I learned this from you years ago about, everyone thinks, oh, sharks, and when my kids were young, Nemo was very big, and it was like the shark smelling the blood and being like, oh, but it's really almost an electrical signal on the skin. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, because obviously scent means something very different underwater. Right. It's just basically an interruption of a chemical pathway. Yeah, so exactly right. And yeah, that is something. And sharks go up and down vertically, and so they're going through different horizontal layers called thermoclines, and they can scent, or I guess perceive, that chemical interruption and follow the trail of that. They think that's how they mate in the deep ocean. Like, how do you find each other? It's big. So
they don't have Varia, right?
Yeah, it's so hard for us to think to take our anthropocentric glasses off and think, we tend to think that we're the show, right, on this planet. But here we are on our 2% of the Earth, and there's this whole big party going on down there that really has nothing to do with us.
Or actually, we have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
We're damaging it, but we're not.
Yeah.
If you could put like a sort of I don't want to say a personality, but of these zones, the midnight zone, the twilight zone. Is there sort of these different things happening in these different zones, different personalities? What would that look like?
So the twilight zone, the top layer of the deep ocean, I think of it as the Manhattan of the deep. It's filled with animals. There are more animals in the twilight zone than in all the other regions of the ocean combined, and they all glow with bioluminescence. And it's really this sort of place where it's eat or be eaten, and everybody's flashing their lights and trying to eat each other and trying to get away from each other. And it's the scene of the world's largest animal migration, which happens every day. Like trillions of these tiny fish, and everybody has seen these pictures of these tiny fish with giant teeth, but they're like 4 inches long. They look like absolute terrors, but then you see them and they're just adorable. They're just these cute little fish with giant teeth and big eyes. And they ascend like as much as 1,000 feet each night and eat phytoplankton and then swim back down. And that is the world's largest animal migration. It's vertical and it happens every single day. But they also eat carbon near the surface and swim it back down, excrete it into the depths where it stays for a long time. And so they're actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere in a huge way. Like they are responsible for sequestering the equivalent of America's annual emissions every year. So these tiny little fish are doing this heavy lift, but it's just a fast happening. Like you go down there, you just feel like you're in a soup of life. You see how much life there is. And like 80% of the microbial life on Earth is in the ocean. And you just get this sense of absolutely every little particle is alive. And that makes it so different than space. And below that in the midnight zone, there's just more bioluminescence, but a slightly less dense congregation of animals. And then in the midnight zone, you also find some larger animals, like a lot of the very cool deep sea sharks that we hardly ever see. Goblin sharks and sleeper sharks and cat sharks. And I always say that if you know the name of a marine creature, it probably swims in the sunlight layer, because most of the animals that swim in the deep, people aren't aware of them. Mm-hmm. And so the giant squid lives down there in the midnight zone, and lots of whales can dive that deep. So you get larger creatures in there. The majority of all known jellyfish species are there. And then below that in the abyss, about half the planet has got waters between 10,000 and 20,000 feet above the seabed. And there are these huge abyssal plains. But there are also these giant geological features like the mid-ocean ridge, which I mentioned earlier. And that is a 40,000 mile long volcano that encircles the Earth, that happens where the tectonic plates are pulling apart. So these are so much bigger than anything we've got on land. And you get these abyssal plains with very subtle animal life. Some of it's very small. Some of it's quite big. But
when you say big, you mean long? Are those the ones where it's more like multiple organisms sort of cooperating together as one?
Yeah, but there are also some like giant animals down there. Like there are giant, they're amphipods. Amphipods are tiny little crustaceans that look a little bit like insects or krill, or and a lot of them are, very small. But then there are supergiant amphipods, which are like the size of a cat. Mm. And they don't know why, but it must be a strategy to avoid getting eaten, that some animals just blow up to gigantic proportions in the abyss. So they have like spider crabs with 12-foot long legs and all kinds of crazy life forms in the abyss, but spread out because it's so vast. And then around the volcanism, there are hydrothermal vents. And so this energy source that powers all of our life above the surface is the sun. But there's a second energy source on the planet, and it's the heat and energy that comes from within the planet. So we've got top down and bottom up. And there's an ecosystem in the deep ocean that comes from the bottom up. And all the animals that live there have nothing to do with the sun. They never see sunlight, but they survive by chemosynthesis. And that's the chemical energy coming from within the earth. They have microbes living in their bodies. Like it's just a completely different way of being alive. And they didn't know that was there till 1977. So it's all pretty new.